The night my parents told me I wasn't their problem anymore, I had two daughters asleep in car seats and $43 in my wallet. I remember the amount precisely because I had counted it at a red light, the way you count things when your brain is trying to stay useful while the rest of you is coming apart. My name is Edward Conlon. I'm 38 years old, and by the time this story is over, you're going to understand why the $100 million was never really the point. But let me take you back to where it started. Because what happened on my parents' porch in October 2010 was the first domino in a line that took 14 years to fall completely. And when it finally did, it fell in front of 300 people on a Tuesday afternoon in the Texas Hill Country. And my parents were right there to watch every inch of it. My wife's name was Laura Conlon, born Laura Whitfield, from a ranching family in Fredericksburg, Texas. She was 27 years old when she died on October 3, 2010, from a brain aneurysm that announced itself at 6:48 in the morning while she was making oatmeal in our kitchen in San Marcos, Texas. She was here, and then she wasn't. No warning, no preparation, no last conversation that we knew was the last. We'd been married 4 years. Our daughters, Grace, who had just turned 3, and May, who was 14 months old, were still asleep in their room when it happened. Grace knew something was wrong because of the sound I made when I found Laura on the kitchen floor. That sound is the one thing I'm grateful she doesn't remember. I was 24 years old. I had a construction estimating job that paid $41,000 a year. I had a rented house with 17 days left on the lease. I had 2 daughters who needed feeding every few hours, and a grief so total it felt structural, like it was load-bearing, like removing it would bring the whole building down. I had no life insurance. We were young. We thought we had time. The hospital released me at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with a folder of paperwork and the phone number of a grief counselor, who I never called because I couldn't figure out which hour of the day to fit that into. I sat in the hospital parking lot for 45 minutes. Then I drove to my parents' house. My parents, Dennis and Carol Conlon, lived in a brick colonial on a cul-de-sac in the Canyon Lake area, about 40 minutes from San Marcos. Dennis was 54 at the time, retired early from a career in municipal water management. Carol was 52, worked part-time doing bookkeeping for a local insurance office. They had a 4-bedroom house with 2 of those bedrooms empty. My younger sister Kristen had moved to Austin 2 years earlier. I want to be precise about this, because some people, when they hear a story like mine, assume the parents must have been monsters all along. Mine weren't. Not exactly. They were the kind of people who were generous when it was comfortable and scarce when it wasn't. They loved in the way that some people love, conditionally, proportionally, with an invisible ledger running in the background that they would have sworn didn't exist. I pulled into their driveway at 3:15 p.m. on October 3, 2010. Grace was awake in the back seat, quiet in the way she'd been since the hospital parking lot. May was asleep. I went to the door and knocked, and my mother opened it with a dish towel over her shoulder and looked at my face and knew. She knew, and she still stepped outside rather than in. I told her Laura was gone. I told her about the aneurysm. I told her about the lease ending. And then I asked, and I want to be clear, I asked because I needed her to understand that this was a request, not an assumption. If the girls and I could stay with them while I sorted out what came next. My mother looked at the car, then at me, then at the car again. Ed, she folded the dish towel. Your father and I, we're not set up for this right now. We just got into a routine, and 2 small children. Mom. The words came out quieter than I felt. Laura died this morning. I know, sweetheart, I know, and it's terrible. But we raised our kids. We paid our time. Your father's blood pressure. 3 weeks. 2 weeks. I just need a floor and I'll figure it out. She looked at the dish towel. My father appeared at the door behind her. He looked at me. He looked at my mother. He did not look at the car where his grandchildren were sitting. My father's answer came with the particular cruelty of a man who believes he's being reasonable. It's not a good time, son. You're a grown man. You'll figure it out. And my mother added, we can't be your rescue every time life gets hard, Edward. Every time. As though I had a history of showing up at their door, as though this was a pattern and not the worst morning of my life. I stood there on that porch for a moment longer than I should have, waiting. I can see that now, for one of them to change their mind. to look past me at those two little girls and be moved by something more than inconvenience. They didn't. I walked back to my car. I buckled myself in. Grace asked where we were going. Grandma and Grandpa Whitfield, I told her. She asked if they had horses. Yes. She accepted that, turned, and looked out the window. I drove 40 miles south on US 290 toward Fredericksburg, toward the Whitfield place, and I want to be honest, I didn't call ahead because I didn't know what to say. I had just watched one set of grandparents decide my daughters weren't worth the inconvenience. I wasn't prepared to find out the score was 2 for 2. I pulled onto the Whitfield property at 5:40 p.m. as the October light went gold over the cedar and live oak. Frank Whitfield, Laura's father, 58 years old at the time, lean and weathered in the way that men get after 3 decades of working land, was coming out of the barn when my headlights swept the drive. He stopped. He looked at the car. He came toward me before I even opened the door. I got out. I didn't know how to start. He took one look at my face and said, "Ed." Just my name, the way people say it when they already know. "She's gone, Frank." He put his hand on the back of my neck the way fathers do, or the way some fathers do, and he held it there for a moment without saying a word. Then he pulled back, looked at the car, and said, "Get those girls inside. Norma's got dinner on. Get those girls inside." 4 words, no conditions, no speech about routines or blood pressure or what they'd signed up for. Norma Whitfield, Laura's mother, 56 years old, a woman who ran a 200-acre cattle and horse operation alongside her husband and still found time to make the best biscuits in Gillespie County, opened the back door of my car before I'd even reached it. She unbuckled May from her car seat and held her against her shoulder and looked at me over the baby's head with wet eyes and a set jaw, the face of a woman deciding to hold herself together for the sake of people who needed her to. "Come inside. You're going to eat something." It was not a suggestion. I sat at the Whitfield's kitchen table that night and ate a bowl of beef stew I couldn't taste because grief does that, flattens everything sensory into a kind of gray static. But I ate it because Norma had set it in front of me, and that felt like the minimum I could do to honor what she was offering. Grace ate most of hers and asked if she could see the horses in the morning. Frank told her she could name one of the new colts if she wanted. Grace thought about it very seriously and said the colt's name should be Butterscotch. Frank wrote it on a notepad and told her it was official. That night, they put the girls in the room that had been Laura's growing up, pink curtains and a bookshelf full of horse figurines, and a rag rug on the hardwood that Norma had braided herself one winter. I slept on a pull-out sofa in the study with a stack of quilts and a nightlight on in the hall so May wouldn't wake up scared in a new place. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't alone. And at 24 years old, with 2 daughters and $43, not being alone was the whole world. I didn't know it that night, but I had just arrived at the place that would become, over the next 14 years, the foundation of everything. The Whitfield operation was, at that time, a working cattle and horse ranch. 200 acres of hill country land outside Fredericksburg, running about 60 head of Hereford Angus cross cattle and a small remuda of working quarter horses. Frank had supplemented with some recreational horseboarding to manage the margins, and Norma ran the books with the same no-nonsense efficiency she applied to everything else. The ranch turned a modest profit most years. Not enough to get comfortable, but enough to stay. I had a degree in civil engineering that I had been using to estimate commercial construction projects. It was decent, steady work, but I had grown up in a suburban house in Canyon Lake, not on a ranch, and I knew approximately nothing about horses beyond the fact that they were large and had opinions. What I knew was numbers, structures, load and stress, and the math of things that had to hold. In the first weeks at the Whitfield place, I told Frank I wanted to earn my keep, not as a favor, but as a condition I'd set for myself, because I came from people who believed in ledgers, and I couldn't fully shake that yet even when I was trying to. Frank put me to work on the fence line, which needed resetting along the south boundary. Straightforward physical labor, the kind that keeps your body busy while your mind is doing something else. Grace adapted to ranch life with a speed that still amazes me. She was 3, resilient in the way only small children can be, because they live entirely in the present tense, and the present tense at the Whitfield place was horses, dogs, biscuits, and a grandmother who had more patience than I would have believed possible. May was too young to understand what had changed. To her, Norma was simply the warm arms that were always there. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. Two grieving little girls take to a ranch and find a new family. It's easy to tell that as a soft story, but it wasn't soft. Every night for the first year, I got the girls to sleep and then sat outside on the porch steps and carried a weight that I wouldn't wish on anybody. I missed Laura in the specific physical way you miss a person who was supposed to be there for every ordinary thing. The school forms, the bedtime negotiations, the dinners, not just the big moments, the Tuesday mornings. What the Whitfields gave us was not a replacement for any of that. They couldn't replace Laura, and they never tried to. What they gave us was structure when we had none, and presence when we needed it, and the quiet, consistent message that we were worth showing up for. My parents called twice in the first 6 months. The first call was my mother checking in the brief, slightly guilty way of a person who knows they made a wrong choice but hasn't quite admitted it to themselves yet. The second call was my father asking whether I'd found a new place yet. The question framed in a way that made it clear the subtext was, "When are you going to stop being a problem?" I told him I was figuring it out. He said that was good. We hung up. Over the next 3 years, my parents made occasional appearances, holidays, Grace's birthday in year 2, a brief visit when May started walking. They were pleasant enough. They asked the right questions. They brought appropriate gifts. And every time, there was a studied quality to their warmth, as though they had rehearsed being the kind of people who showed up rather than actually being them. I never said this out loud. I just noticed it the way you notice a structural crack. Not urgent, not dramatic, just evidence of something running underneath. The Whitfields noticed it too. Norma said nothing, ever, about my parents. Not one word. Not one eyebrow raise. That restraint was itself a form of grace. 3 years after Laura died, in 2013, Frank sat me down at the kitchen table one Sunday morning after the girls had gone out to the paddock with Norma. "I want to talk to you about the land." He spread out a legal plat on the table, the 200-acre survey, the boundary lines, the soil classifications. He explained that he and Norma were getting older, that the ranch needed a plan, and that the plan he and Norma had agreed on was this: if I was willing to commit fully, to take the operation over, bring my engineering background to the business side, and grow it deliberately, he would begin the process of transferring operational authority to me now, with full ownership to vest over 10 years. "We're not giving it away," Frank said, with the directness of a man who thinks sentiment is fine, but clear terms are better. "You take on the mortgage note and the operating liability, but we'll be here, and the land is yours to build on." I looked at the plat for a long moment. You'd take on the mortgage and the operating liability. That was a real offer. Not charity. Partnership. With stakes on both sides. "Why me?" I asked. Not falsely modest. Genuinely asking. Frank looked at me the way he'd looked at me that first night in the driveway. "Because Laura saw something in you, and because I've watched you for 3 years, and you work hard, you're honest, and you don't run from things that are difficult." A pause. "Also, Grace named that colt Butterscotch, and it stuck, and I figure anyone connected to that decision has some commitment to this place." I laughed. First real laugh in longer than I could track. "Okay, let's build something." Building something turned out to be a 14-year project, which in hindsight makes complete sense, because anything worth building takes longer than you think and costs more than you planned, and there is always a moment somewhere in the middle where you seriously consider whether the whole enterprise was a mistake. Mine came in 2016. By then, I had been running the Whitfield operation, which I'd quietly begun calling Conlon Whitfield Ranch in the operating documents, with Frank's blessing, for 3 years. I'd used my engineering background to redesign the water infrastructure, adding a rainwater harvesting system that reduced our irrigation costs significantly and improving the stock tank layout across the south pasture. I'd grown the horse boarding from 6 stalls to 18, adding a dedicated training arena on the north end of the property. The cattle herd had grown to 90 head. Revenue was up 40% over 2013 baseline. What I'd also done, quietly and carefully, was start breeding quarter horses for performance, specifically cutting and reining. The hill country has a long tradition of working horse events, and the performance quarter horse market when you know the bloodlines in your patient, can be extraordinarily profitable. I knew the bloodlines. Frank had taught me. I was patient because I didn't have a choice. The crisis in 2016 was operational. A drought that hit Gillespie County hard enough that the hay market tripled overnight. We lost 12 head of cattle to heat stress, and the bank called to discuss the operating line of credit in terms that were not a discussion. I was 30 years old, 2 girls in elementary school, and staring at a spreadsheet that told me I was 6 months from not being able to make payroll. Frank and Norma sat at that same kitchen table, and I spread that spreadsheet out the same way Frank had spread the plat 3 years earlier and told them exactly where we stood. Frank looked at the numbers. Norma looked at me. "What do you need?" Frank said. "Time. And about $80,000 in bridge capital to get through the hay season and restructure the feed contracts." "Where are you going to get it?" "I have a plan. But I need to know you're both okay with more risk before I move forward." Frank looked at Norma. Norma looked at Frank. Something passed between them that had no words in it. Then Frank looked back at me. "We're in this together. What's the plan?" The plan was a calculated risk. I had a 4-year-old quarter horse stallion. Registered name High Point Ranger, call name Ranger, out of a breeding line I'd been quietly developing since 2014. Ranger had won 2 NRHA reining events as a 3-year-old and had the bloodlines in the movement to be a serious breeding prospect. I hadn't listed him as a stud because I'd planned to wait until he had more competition record. The drought changed the math. I listed Ranger for performance sales at a regional equine sale event in San Antonio that September. I drove him there myself, Grace riding in the passenger seat at 10 years old, with a hand-lettered sign she'd made that said, "Go Ranger," which I made her keep in the truck because I felt it might undercut the professional atmosphere. Ranger sold for $340,000 to a buyer from the King Ranch operation in Kingsville. We made payroll. We paid down the operating line. We survived the drought year. And I sat in that truck outside the sale barn for a moment after the check cleared and thought about what my father had said to me in 2010. "You're a grown man. You'll figure it out." He meant it as a dismissal. It had turned out to be accidentally accurate. Between 2016 and 2022, the ranch grew in ways I hadn't fully projected when I drew up the 10-year plan. The performance breeding program became the primary revenue engine, producing horses that competed and placed consistently at major NRHA and NCHA events. That's the National Reining Horse Association and the National Cutting Horse Association, 2 of the premier performance horse circuits in the country. A placing horse in those circuits doesn't just win prize money. It builds a bloodline reputation that multiplies stud fee and offspring sale value over years. By 2020, the ranch, now formally titled Conlon Whitfield Performance Horses LLC, had a waiting list for breeding contracts and had produced 3 horses that sold above $400,000. Frank and Norma stayed in the house on the property. That was always the arrangement. The land transferred to me on schedule in 2023, per the original agreement, with the farmhouse reserved for their lifetime occupancy. Frank's health had begun to slow by then. Nothing dramatic, but the knees and the back that come with decades of ranch work were making themselves known. Norma was still sharp as a fence wire and ran the breeding records with the same precision she'd always applied to everything. Grace, now 16 in 2023, had grown up on that land and worked it with a confidence that still made me catch my breath sometimes. The way she moved around horses, calm and certain, like she'd been born to it. May, 14, was quieter about the ranch but equally absorbed in it. She developed an interest in the genetics and data side, tracking bloodline performance metrics with a spreadsheet's precision that I could only describe as unsettlingly good at 14. Laura would have loved watching this, I thought sometimes. Usually in the evenings, when the light went gold over the hill country cedar and the horses moved in the near pasture and the house smelled like dinner, Laura would have been insufferably proud. In early 2023, I was approached by a private equity real estate group based in Austin that had been quietly acquiring hill country ranch properties for a larger consolidated development project targeting high-end recreational land use. Think luxury outdoor resort, equestrian retreat, that category of project that the Texas hill country has become increasingly attractive for due to proximity to Austin and San Antonio. The first approach was informal, a phone call from a broker I'd met at a Fredericksburg chamber event the year before. He told me there was buyer interest in hill country horse operations with existing infrastructure and wanted to know if I'd be open to a conversation. I told him I'd listen. Over the following 4 months, I had conversations, retained a transactional attorney in Austin named Philip Hartley, and arrived at a number that, when Philip put it in writing and slid it across the conference table, made the room feel slightly tilted. $102 million for the land, the improvements, the infrastructure, and the operating business assets. The breeding bloodline archive, the genetic documentation, the registration records, the competition history, transferred separately in a licensing arrangement that allowed me to continue a smaller breeding operation if I chose. The farmhouse and 2 acres surrounding it were excluded from the sale, per an irrevocable reservation I'd insisted on in the early structuring conversations. Frank and Norma's home stayed theirs. That was non-negotiable from the first conversation, and it never came up again after I made that clear. I signed the agreement on March 14, 2024. I was 38 years old. My parents found out about the sale the way most people in my extended circle did, through a local business brief in the Fredericksburg Standard Radio Post, which ran a small item on the ranch transaction in late March 2024. The item mentioned the sale price and my name. My mother called that same afternoon. I let it ring. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. She left a voicemail. It was warm, warmer than anything she'd left in the previous 14 years. The news, the pride, the too long gap. She and Dennis would love to come to the celebration, she mentioned. If we were planning one. The celebration she'd heard we were planning. I stood in the kitchen and listened to that voicemail twice. Then I called Philip Hartley and asked him a legal question about trust structures. Then I called Grace into the kitchen and told her what I was thinking about doing. Grace is 16. She listened the way she always listens, still and complete, the way her mother used to. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, do Frank and Norma know? Not the full plan. Not yet. Are you going to tell them before? No, I want their reaction to be real. She thought about it. Okay, a beat. Dad, Grandma Carol's going to make a face. I know. I want to see it. Me too, kiddo. The celebration was scheduled for Saturday, April 27, 2024, on the ranch grounds, technically the last weekend before the buyer's formal possession date, which meant the land was still mine and I could use it for one final event. 300 guests, catered by a hill country barbecue outfit out of Johnson City, a temporary stage set up near the old training arena. Frank had wanted a tent in case of rain. I'd told him to trust April. He'd given me the look of a man who has farmed in Central Texas for 4 decades and knows better than to trust April. He was right. As it turned out, there was a brief rain shower around noon that cleared out by 2 p.m. and left everything smelling like cedar and wet limestone, which is the best smell in the world, and I will not hear otherwise. My parents arrived at 1:45 p.m. in Dennis's truck. My mother had her hair done. She was wearing a blouse I didn't recognize. My father had on his good boots. They walked in with the energy of people who had been thinking about this moment and had decided to treat it as a homecoming. My sister Kristen was there too. She'd driven down from Austin with her husband, Tom. Kristen and I had maintained a relationship over the years that was honest if not close. She knew broadly how things had gone in 2010. She had not been the one who turned me away, but she had also not been the one who pushed back on the people who did. At some point, you have to make peace with that category of person. Not the perpetrators, just the witnesses who decided the cost of speaking up was too high. I'd made that peace mostly. Kristen hugged me when she arrived and said she was proud of me, and I believed her. My parents found me near the stage about 30 minutes before the program started. My mother hugged me and held on longer than she usually did. My father shook my hand and said, "Son, what you've built here." His voice had something in it I didn't recognize right away. Then I placed it. It was pride. Genuine, unqualified pride. And the complicated thing, the thing I want to be honest about, was that it landed. It still landed, even now, even after everything. Because that's what fathers do when they finally say the thing you needed. They say it too late, and it still means something, and you have to figure out how to hold both of those things at the same time. I told them I was glad they could make it. I meant it in the way you mean things that are true and also insufficient. I didn't tell them what was coming. The program started at 3 p.m. Philip Hartley stood at the podium first, ran through a brief business summary for the assembled guests, context for the transaction, the history of the ranch, the scope of the sale. He was precise and unhurried, the way good attorneys are. Then I walked up. 300 people. Hill country neighbors, horse industry contacts, auction house representatives, magazine editors from Western Horseman, and the Quarter Horse Journal. Frank and Norma's church community, the girls' school friends, ranch hands who'd worked with us over the years. People who had shown up for this land in one way or another. Frank and Norma were in the front row. Frank had his good hat on. Norma was sitting perfectly straight with her hands folded in her lap, the way she sits when she's trying not to show that she's nervous. I looked at them for a moment before I started. They still don't know. Good. I started with the ranch, the land, what it had taught me, what I'd put into it, what it had given back. I kept that part short because the people in this crowd already knew the story and didn't need a summary. What they didn't know was what came next. Before we finalize anything today, I told the crowd, I want to announce two things that matter more to me than any transaction. I nodded to my left. A banner unfurled from the temporary stage rigging, the design I'd worked on with a graphic firm in Austin for 3 weeks. Clean and bold and right. The Laura Conlon Foundation for Rural Family Stability. I heard Norma make a sound. I kept my eyes on the banner for a moment. My late wife, Laura Whitfield Conlon, grew up on this land. She loved it, and she left it behind too young. And she left 2 daughters and a husband who didn't know what to do with themselves. The foundation is funded at $5 million from the sale proceeds. Its purpose is to provide emergency support and resources to families in rural communities facing sudden hardship, specifically families who have lost a primary earner and need a bridge to something stable. Because in October 2010, my family needed that bridge, and the people who built it for us are sitting right there. I pointed directly at Frank and Norma. The crowd turned. I saw Frank put his hand on Norma's. Frank and Norma Whitfield took in a 24-year-old widower with 2 toddlers on the worst night of his life. They didn't ask what we could do for them. They set 2 more plates. They handed my daughters a home, and they handed me a purpose, and they asked for nothing in return. Not in 14 years. Not once. A pause. Let it land. So the second announcement is this. The farmhouse and the 2 acres surrounding it, the parcel reserved from the sale, will be transferred by deed to Frank and Norma Whitfield this week, free, clear, and in perpetuity. Their home. Always. The crowd rose. Not politely, actually rose. The way people stand when something moves them before they've decided to. Frank looked straight ahead for a moment. He was doing the thing men of his generation do when they're trying not to cry in public. Jaw set, blink slow, breathe through it. Norma was not attempting that discipline. She was crying freely, and I loved her for it. I found their eyes and held them for a moment. Thank you. It's not enough. It's what I've got. I want to tell you about a specific detail in my peripheral vision during that applause, because it's the part of the story that people come for, and it earned its place. My parents were standing about 15 feet to the left of the stage. I could see them without looking directly at them. My mother's face had done something complicated. She had arrived at this event with the expression of a woman who expected to be welcomed into a success story she could claim adjacency to. The expression had moved, during the part about October 2010, during the part about 2 plates being set, during the part about Frank and Norma, through several phases that I can only describe as a controlled demolition. Slow, then faster, then a settled kind of stillness that wasn't peace. My father looked at the stage, then at Frank and Norma receiving the crowd's applause, then at the banner with Laura's name on it, then at me. I held his gaze for exactly as long as felt honest. Then I looked back at Frank and Norma, because they were the ones who deserved my eyes. After the applause settled, I stepped to the microphone one last time. Family, quietly, into a crowd that had gone still, is not who shares your name. It's who shows up when showing up is the only thing that matters. The night my daughters and I arrived on Frank and Norma's porch, they didn't evaluate whether we were a burden. They just opened the door. A beat. I've spent 14 years trying to deserve that. I stepped back. The program concluded. My mother found me near the catering tables about 40 minutes later. She'd clearly been working up to the approach. I'd seen her circling at a distance for a while, recalibrating. She started with, "That was a beautiful tribute to Laura." "Thank you." A pause. "Edward, I want you to know, your father and I think about that time. We think about what we should have." "Mom," I kept my voice level. "I'm not angry at you. I want you to understand that." I meant it. The anger had burned down to something quieter and more permanent over 14 years. Not forgiveness exactly. Not bitterness exactly. Just clarity. What you did in 2010 told me something true about what I could count on, and I built my life from what I actually had, not from what I wished I had. That worked out. She looked at me. Something in her face was working. She tried once more, quieter this time. "The girls, could there be a way to know them better? Now?" It was the right question. 14 years too late and still the right one. "That's up to them. Grace is 16 and May is 14. They have their own opinions about what they want. If you want a relationship with them, you ask them directly." "Not me." She nodded. Twice. The nod of a person accepting terms they know they have no standing to negotiate. My father came over and stood beside her. He looked at me for a long moment. Then the words came, slow and deliberate. "I was wrong. In 2010, what we did was wrong." 6 words. 14 years in the making. I let them sit for a moment because they deserved to sit. I know you were." That was enough. Not a reconciliation, not a repair, but an acknowledgement witnessed by nothing but the two of us, that what happened was real and he knew it. That mattered to me in a way I hadn't fully expected. I want to step back from the personal and say something that I think this story earns the right to say. There is a category of people in the world who measure their generosity against what it costs them. To them, helping someone is a transaction. I extend something, I am owed something, and if the balance doesn't work out in my favor, I don't extend it. My parents were this kind of people. Not cruel, not malicious, just transactional. When I showed up at their door in 2010 with 2 daughters and nothing, they ran the numbers and decided I didn't pencil out. And then there is the other category, the Frank and Norma Whitefields of the world. People who operate from a different set of premises entirely. To them, a person in need is simply that, a person in need. The calculation is not what do I get, it's what does this person need and can I provide it. The debt runs in one direction, not from the helped to the helper, but from the helped to the world, to be paid forward when the opportunity comes. That is a different way to live. It is also, as it turns out, what actually builds a life worth living. Frank and Norma didn't take us in so that one day I would sell a ranch for $100 million and give them a house. They didn't take us in because they expected anything. They did it because 2 little girls and their wrecked father needed somewhere to go, and they had somewhere to offer. The return was never the point. The deed to that farmhouse was not a reward. It was a recognition. The only language I had for you changed everything was here. This is yours. You should have it. Norma called me the morning after the celebration, before I'd even had coffee. She'd been up early. She's always up early. Always will be. Edward. Her voice had that morning quality, direct and warm. The house. Yes, you didn't have to do that. I know. But you did. Yes. A long pause. Then, Laura would have liked watching you figure all this out, you know. I had to take a breath before I answered that. Yeah. I think she would have given me a hard time about it, too. Norma laughed. The specific laugh of someone who knew Laura Whitfield from birth and recognized the accuracy of that statement completely. She would have. Lord, she would have. By June 2024, the sale had fully closed. The buyer's development team had moved onto the property. The training arena I'd built in 2015 was already scheduled for renovation into a boutique equestrian facility. The cattle pens were coming down. The land was becoming something else, which was the deal, and I'd made my peace with it. Frank and Norma were in their house, which was now legally and irrevocably theirs. Frank had finally let the orthopedist address his knee. He walked without the hitch for the first time in 3 years and spent a full morning in May demonstrating this to Grace by walking from the barn to the fence line and back without stopping, which Grace timed on her phone and reported to me with complete seriousness. May had submitted a proposal to the Laura Conlon Foundation's first grant cycle, not for herself, but as a volunteer researcher who wanted to help identify qualifying applicants in Gillespie and Kerr counties. She was 14. The foundation's executive director, a woman named Susan Park who I'd recruited from a nonprofit in San Antonio, called me after their first meeting and said, "Your daughter is going to run this organization someday. I'm telling you now." I told her I knew. My parents came to Fredericksburg once in the summer, in July 2024, for a visit the girls had agreed to. I was present but stayed in the background. Grace was cordial and watchful. She has her mother's ability to be gracious in a room without giving more than she's chosen to give. May was polite and slightly distant in the way 14-year-olds are when they haven't fully decided what they think yet. My mother brought banana bread. My father helped Frank move some stored equipment from the tool shed without being asked, which Frank told me afterward was, in his estimation, a reasonable starting point for a man. Nobody cried. Nobody said anything definitive. The door was open an inch, which was more than it had been in 14 years, and I left it there to decide its own direction. The Laura Conlon Foundation gave out its first grant that September, $18,000 to a 26-year-old single father in Kerrville, Texas, who had lost his wife to a cardiac event 6 months earlier and was trying to keep his 2 sons in the house they'd lived in since before the boys could remember. He'd applied with a 2-page letter that May had flagged for the review committee, citing the passage where he described counting the money in his wallet in a hospital parking lot. She hadn't told me that detail when she flagged it. When Susan Park sent me the application summary and I read that line, I had to put my phone face down on the counter and stand at the kitchen window for a while. The number was $43. $43. Different man, different hospital parking lot, different state. But close enough that I felt the specific weight of it in my chest like something I'd carried for 14 years and just set down. We approved the full amount the same afternoon. Grace turned 17 in October 2024. We had a small dinner at Frank and Norma's, the house that was now officially, legally, permanently theirs, and Norma made the biscuits and Frank grilled, and May got into an extended argument with Grace about the correct name for the color of the sunset, which somehow escalated to involve a color wheel May had looked up on her phone. I sat at that table and looked at my daughters, one arguing confidently about mauve versus rose gold, one pointing at a phone screen as legal evidence, and thought about a kitchen floor in San Marcos in October 2010, and a 4-hour drive in the dark, and a man who came out of a barn in the headlights and said my name like he already knew. The $100 million bought us the deed and the foundation and the house for Frank and Norma. What it couldn't buy, what couldn't be purchased at any number, was what was already at that table, what was already built, what had been built from nothing, slowly, over 14 years of showing up, by people who never asked what they were going to get for it. My father had said I'd figure it out. He was right. I just needed the right people to figure it out with. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.